You know what's funny about betrayal? It never announces itself. It doesn't walk through the door wearing a sign that says, "I'm about to destroy your life." No. It comes disguised as sacrifice, wrapped in promises, delivered with a kiss on the forehead and a, "I'm doing this for us, baby." I couldn't believe how easily I fell for it. How I stood there nodding like a fool when my husband told me he was leaving for a year. A whole year. Right when his mother was dying of cancer. He called it a promotion. He called it an opportunity. He called it our ticket to financial freedom. The truth? He was a liar, a cheater, and the most dangerous kind of coward. The kind who abandons the people who need him most, and somehow makes you feel grateful for it. For 12 months, I became a ghost in my own life. For most of that year, her decline was slow. Then, in the last month, it became a free fall. I worked doubles. I changed bed sheets soaked with sickness. I held my mother-in-law's hand through pain that would make grown men weep. And I did it all alone while my husband left me with $400 and empty promises from what he claimed was London. But here's the secret nobody tells you about being humiliated and used. Eventually, the shame transforms. It hardens into something sharp, something that cuts both ways. And when I finally discovered the truth, when those photos synced from Miami, when I saw him living in luxury with her while I was selling my jewelry to afford his mother's medication, that's when everything changed. That's when the woman who'd been too tired to fight became the woman who'd been gathering evidence. But this story isn't just about a cheating husband or even about revenge, though God knows there's plenty of that coming. This is about what a dying woman whispered to me 3 days before she took her last breath. Words that sounded like dementia, but turned out to be the most lucid thing anyone had ever said to me. After the funeral, go back to Ashford. Go to my old kitchen. Dig under the floorboards beneath the preserved crock. Dig deep, Karen. What you find there will give you everything you need. I thought she was losing her mind. I thought the morphine was talking. What happened next proved that Margaret had been planning my liberation longer than I'd been married to her son. And the shocking truth she'd buried wasn't just money. It was a weapon that would dismantle his entire identity. See, my mother-in-law knew something about her son that he didn't even know about himself, and she'd spent decades hiding it, protecting it, saving it for exactly this moment. When I drove to that house she'd kept sealed up for years and tore up those floorboards, when I opened that rusted tin and saw what was inside, I finally understood what justice looks like when it's been fermented in secrecy for 30 years. $150,000, legal documents that rewrote his entire existence, and a letter that began with, "Dear Karen, you deserved better than my son, but since you got stuck with him, at least take everything he thought was his." And the karma of it was almost poetic. He'd left me to bury his mother alone, and she'd left me the tools to bury him. So let me take you back to where it started, to the day a taxi pulled up and changed everything, to the moment I became both caretaker and detective without knowing it yet. Let me show you how a man can betray everyone who loves him and still sleep soundly at night. Let me tell you about Miami and Google Photos, and the exact moment I realized my marriage was a performance where I was the only one who didn't know we were acting. But most importantly, let me tell you about digging. Not just into dirt and floorboards, but into secrets, into lies, into the rotten foundation of a man who thought he could abandon his dying mother and get away with it. Because Margaret was right about one thing. He came back. Of course he came back. Not for me, not for grief, but because he smelled money and inheritance, and one last chance to take what wasn't his. He'd promised a year in London, but the truth was he'd been pretending to be trapped overseas while living it up in Miami. He flew home thinking he'd won, thinking he'd managed his double life perfectly, thinking his dead mother's estate was his for the taking. What he didn't know was that his mother had spent her final lucid moments arming me for war, and I'd spent the weeks since her death becoming the kind of woman who doesn't just survive betrayal. I became the kind who makes damn sure it never happens to anyone else. So buckle up, because this story has plot twists that would make a soap opera writer jealous, and every single one of them ends with him losing something he thought was permanent. His lies, his money, his identity, and eventually, his freedom. When he walked through that door, I didn't confront him immediately. I handed him one envelope and watched his face collapse. The taxi pulled up to the curb, and I felt my stomach twist before I even opened the door. There she was. Margaret, my mother-in-law, slumped against the seat like her bones couldn't hold her up anymore. Her skin had that grayish tone you see in hospital hallways. And her eyes, God, her eyes looked right through me with something I couldn't name yet. My husband Daniel practically shoved her suitcase into my hands, muttering something about running late and important calls. The air smelled like antiseptic and something worse underneath, like decay trying to hide behind floral perfume. I reached out to help Margaret up the porch steps, and she gripped my arm so tight I thought she'd leave marks. She didn't say thank you or complain about the pain. She just stared at Daniel's back as he rushed to grab his own luggage from the trunk. "He's always in such a hurry now, isn't he?" she whispered, and I felt this cold shiver run down my spine. There was something in her voice that wasn't just sickness. It was knowledge, heavy and sharp like a knife you don't see coming. I wanted to ask what she meant, but Daniel was already barking orders about where to put things. Inside, the house felt smaller with her there, like her illness took up physical space in every room. Daniel kept checking his watch, pacing between the kitchen and the hallway, and I couldn't shake this feeling that he was performing something, playing the role of concerned son, but forgetting his lines. Margaret settled into the guest room, and I heard her labored breathing through the walls, each inhale sounding like it cost her everything. When I brought her tea, she touched my hand and said, "You're a good girl, Karen. Better than what you signed up for." The words hung in the air like smoke, and I didn't know yet that they were a warning. That evening, Daniel announced his news over a dinner nobody was eating. His company was sending him to London for a year. A huge promotion, he said, the kind that would pay for Margaret's treatment, and then some. He slid a credit card across the table like it was a peace offering, saying there was enough to cover basics while he was gone. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He was leaving me alone with his dying mother, with my job, with everything, and calling it a sacrifice he was making. The betrayal of it didn't hit me yet. I was too busy drowning in the logistics of survival. Margaret didn't react to the news, just kept stirring her soup in slow circles, and that's when I saw it, that look again. Pity mixed with resignation, like she'd watched this movie before and knew how it ended. Daniel kissed my forehead, promised to video call every week, and said he'd be back before we knew it, with enough money to solve everything. As he walked out that door with his perfectly packed suitcase, Margaret's breathing got heavier, more labored, and she whispered something I almost didn't catch. "He left, Karen. In your heart, consider that he left for good." I laughed it off as morphine talking, but somewhere deep down, my gut twisted with the truth I wasn't ready to face. The door clicked shut, and the house fell into this suffocating silence. Just me, a dying woman, and the ghost of a marriage I didn't know was already dead. Margaret's eyes followed me as I cleaned up the untouched plates, and I could feel her wanting to say more, to warn me about something I couldn't see yet. The credit card sat on the counter like a cruel joke, and I had no idea that within days, I'd discover it had barely enough to cover groceries, let alone medical bills. Everything I thought I knew about my life was about to cave in, and all I had was a woman who could barely breathe and a husband who'd just shown me exactly how little I mattered. The first week after Daniel left felt like I'd been dropped into someone else's nightmare and told to just deal with it. He called exactly once, a video chat where he stood in what looked like a fancy hotel lobby, all smiles and excuses about settling in and crazy work schedule. I was literally holding a basin for Margaret while she threw up her medication, my hair unwashed for 3 days, and he's there talking about his corner office with a view. The payback for his so-called sacrifice was supposed to be covering our expenses. But when I checked that credit card balance, my blood ran cold. $400. $400. For a year of cancer treatment, rent, food, and everything else. I called him immediately, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. "Daniel, there's some mistake with the card. There's barely anything on it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady even though I wanted to scream. He sighed like I was being dramatic, like I was the problem, and fed me this line about temporary hold and wire transfer coming next week. The lies came so smooth, so practiced, that I actually believed him for a second. He promised the big money was coming, that this promotion meant a 6-figure bonus, that I just needed to hold on a little longer. Meanwhile, Margaret was in the next room gasping for air, and I was calculating whether I could afford both her pain meds and electricity this month. That wire transfer never came. Neither did the next week's call, or the one after that. Daniel started missing our scheduled video chats, sending short texts instead, always with some excuse about client emergency or time zone confusion. When he did finally call, 2 weeks later, he looked tan. Tan. Like he'd been lying on a beach somewhere while I was watching his mother waste away in my guest room. I mentioned it, trying to sound casual, and he laughed it off as good hotel lighting and finally getting some sun on lunch breaks. The gaslighting was so smooth I almost doubted my own eyes, but Margaret heard that call, and I saw her face twist with something between disgust and heartbreak. The truth about that card became brutally clear when Margaret had her first real crisis. She collapsed in the bathroom at 3 a.m, and the ambulance ride alone wiped out half of what Daniel had left us. The hospital wanted to admit her, but without proper insurance authorization, which Daniel was supposed to handle from London because the insurance was through his employer. They were looking at me for payment guarantees I couldn't give. I stood there in that fluorescent-lit hallway, exhausted and humiliated, begging a social worker for payment plans while my mother-in-law lay on a gurney behind a curtain. This was the vengeance Daniel's promotion had earned me. Poverty, shame, and the crushing weight of knowing I'd been abandoned with a dying woman and called it love. I started pulling double shifts at work, leaving Margaret with a neighbor for hours I couldn't afford to pay back. My boss was understanding at first, but you can only leave early for family emergency so many times before the sympathy runs dry. Daniel's video calls became a sick kind of theater. He'd put on his concerned husband face, ask about his mother in that careful voice, and I'd lie through my teeth that everything's fine, because what else could I do? Tell him I was falling apart, that his mother was asking for him in her sleep, that I'd started having panic attacks in my car before going inside because I couldn't face another night of this. He didn't want to know the truth. And honestly, I was too tired to fight for dignity. I'd already lost. Margaret got weaker, and I got harder. Something shifted in me during those endless nights of changing sheets, crushing pills, measuring doses, and pretending I wasn't drowning. She'd watch me move through the house like a ghost, and sometimes she'd try to apologize. For her son, for the burden, for everything. Don't, I'd tell her. Because it wasn't her fault that her son was a coward who'd rather send $400 in fake concern than actually show up. But late one night, after a particularly bad episode, she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength and whispered, "Karen, he's not in London for work. I know my son." The way she said it made my stomach drop. But before I could ask what she meant, her eyes rolled back, and I had to focus on keeping her breathing. My life became this brutal cycle of wake up, survive, collapse, repeat. I'd drag myself out of bed at 5 a.m. to check if Margaret was still breathing, change her if she needed it, force down some coffee that tasted like dirt, and rush to my job at the marketing firm where I smiled through presentations like I wasn't dying inside. During lunch breaks, I'd call pharmacies comparing prices on medications, begging for generic alternatives, doing math in my head that never added up to enough. Then I'd race back home, usually grabbing fast food I couldn't afford because I was too exhausted to cook, and walk into that house that smelled like sickness and broken promises. The karma of marrying Daniel was turning my 20s into a prison sentence I never saw coming. The hospital visits were the worst kind of torture. Margaret needed checkups, blood work, scans, all these things that required co-pays I'd put on credit cards that were maxing out faster than I could breathe. The nurses started recognizing me, giving me those sympathetic looks that made me want to scream because sympathy doesn't pay bills. One of them pulled me aside after a particularly expensive visit and handed me a list of charity programs, her voice all gentle like she was telling me my dog died. "Honey, you look like you're gonna collapse yourself," she said. And I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten a real meal or slept more than 3 hours straight. This wasn't just exhaustion. It was erasure. Like I was disappearing one sleepless night at a time. Daniel's video calls became this sick performance art that made me want to throw my phone through a wall. He'd pop up on screen with his hair gelled, wearing expensive shirts I didn't recognize, asking how's everything going, like we were discussing the weather. I'd be standing in Margaret's room with medical equipment beeping in the background, stains on my shirt from helping her to the bathroom, and he'd complain about his stressful day of meetings and business dinners. The backstabbed feeling hit me every single time. This man had left me holding his dying mother while he lived some fantasy life and expected me to smile through it. When I tried to tell him how bad things really were, he'd sigh and say, "Karen, I'm working 16-hour days to pay for all of this." And I'd swallow my rage because fighting took energy I didn't have. The money situation went from bad to catastrophic. That $400 evaporated in the first week, and Daniel's promises of incoming transfers turned into delays with international banking, and then just silence. I started selling things, my jewelry, my laptop, clothes I'd never wear again because who has time for looking nice when you're playing hospice nurse? I picked up freelance work at night after Margaret fell asleep, designing logos and social media posts for $50 here, $75 there, anything to keep the lights on. My friends stopped calling because I always said no to plans, and honestly, I couldn't believe I'd become this person, isolated, broke, running on fumes and spite. The infidelity of Daniel's absence felt worse than if he'd just cheated. At least then I'd have a reason to leave. Margaret's health deteriorated in ways that made me understand why people break. She'd have good days where she could sit up and we'd watch old movies, and then bad days where she couldn't keep down water and I'd spend hours just trying to keep her comfortable. The hospice nurse who started coming twice a week looked at me like I was a martyr, but I wasn't. I was just trapped. Daniel would call during her worst moments, and I'd step into the hallway to take it, listening to him talk about the amazing Indian restaurant he'd tried, or the stunning architecture in London while his mother was literally dying 10 feet away. The humiliation of it burned through me like acid. How did I become the person holding everyone's suffering while the man who should be here got to play tourist? One night, after 72 hours of almost no sleep because Margaret's pain was unmanageable, I sat on my bathroom floor and just sobbed. Not quiet crying, the ugly choking kind where you can't catch your breath and you don't care who hears. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. A selfie of him at some corporate event, champagne glass in hand, caption saying, "Wish you were here." I stared at that photo until my vision blurred, and something inside me cracked wide open. The shamed feeling of being abandoned, of being discarded, of being expected to just take it all with grace. It transformed into something else, something cold and sharp. Margaret called my name from the other room, her voice weak and scared, and I wiped my face, stood up, and went back to being the person no one appreciated. But the rage had started building, and I didn't know it yet, but I was about to discover exactly why I should have trusted that rage all along. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my entire world exploded, and the funny thing is, I almost didn't find out at all. Margaret needed her insurance documents for a new prescription, and she thought they might be on Daniel's old laptop, the one he'd left behind because he'd upgraded for work. I dug it out of the closet, covered in dust, and booted it up expecting boring spreadsheets and maybe some old photos. The thing took forever to start, wheezing like it was dying too, and I was half watching it while stirring soup on the stove. Then I heard that little notification sound, the one that means something's sinking, and my stomach did this weird flip for no reason I could name yet. Google Photos was open, updating automatically because Daniel never logged out of anything. I watched the screen populate with thumbnails, expecting to see gray London streets or his boring office building, but instead, palm trees, bright blue ocean, poolside bars with tropical drinks. My hand froze on the mouse as image after image loaded, and not one of them looked anything like England. The shocking realization hit me in waves. This wasn't some old vacation folder. These photos had dates from last week, 3 days ago, yesterday. I clicked on one with shaking hands, and there he was. My husband, Daniel, lounging on a beach chair in swimming trunks, sunglasses on, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. The location tag at the bottom made my blood turn to ice. Miami Beach, Florida. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, so I kept clicking, kept scrolling. like maybe I'd misread something or the app was glitched. But every photo confirmed the truth I'd been too exhausted to suspect. Daniel at a fancy restaurant with ocean views. Daniel on a yacht. Daniel holding one of those ridiculous cocktails with umbrellas in it, grinning like he didn't have a dying mother and a wife falling apart back home. And then I saw her. Natalie. His work friend who he'd mentioned casually over the years, always with that throwaway line, "She's like a sister, Em." Totally platonic. She was in a bikini next to him, her hand on his chest, both of them laughing at something only they understood. The betrayal of it hit me so hard I had to sit down before I fell down. I went through every single photo like I was gathering evidence for a trial, which I guess I was. There were dozens of them, spanning back weeks, maybe months. Sunset dinners, couples massages, a hotel room with rose petals on the bed. One particularly gut-wrenching shot showed them toasting champagne glasses. And that's when I noticed the ring. Not a promise ring. An engagement ring. Either she was someone else's fiancé, or Daniel was planning a life without me. The truth crystallized in my mind with brutal clarity. Daniel hadn't been sent to London for work. He'd lied, completely and deliberately, so he could abandon his responsibilities and play house with his mistress in Miami. While I'd been rationing Margaret's pain medication and selling my belongings to keep us afloat, he'd been living in luxury with the woman he'd probably been cheating with for God knows how long. The humiliation burned through every cell in my body. My first instinct was to call him, to scream, to demand answers. But something stopped me. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe it was the cold rage that had been building in me for weeks, finally finding its target. I sat there in front of that laptop, soup burning on the stove behind me, and I started taking screenshots of everything. Every photo, every location tag, every lying, cheating, backstabbing piece of evidence. I created a folder, labeled it with the date, and saved it all to a thumb drive I found in the desk drawer. My hands were steady now, mechanical, like I'd become someone else entirely. Someone who documented instead of confronted, who planned instead of reacted. Margaret called out from her room, asking if I was okay because she'd heard me go quiet. I closed the laptop, wiped my face even though I hadn't realized I was crying, and went to check on her. She took one look at me and knew something had shifted. "You found something," she said, and it wasn't a question. I nodded, and she closed her eyes like she'd been waiting for this moment. "Miami," she whispered, and my jaw dropped because how the hell did she know? She reached for my hand with those frail fingers and said, I'd seen charges she couldn't explain. Names, cities. She knew before I did. She just didn't have proof. "I've known my son was rotten for a long time, Karen. I just didn't know how to tell you without proof." The weight of her words settled over me, and I realized this dying woman had been protecting me, waiting for me to see the truth myself. And now that I had it, now that I knew about the lies and the cheating and the infidelity he'd wrapped in excuses about promotions and sacrifice, something dangerous woke up inside me. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Margaret's decline accelerated after I found those photos. Like her body had been holding on just long enough for me to see the truth. Within days, she couldn't get out of bed anymore. Couldn't keep food down. Could barely string sentences together without drifting off mid-thought. The hospice nurse told me we were looking at weeks, maybe days, and I should prepare myself for the end. But how do you prepare for losing the one person who'd been honest with you when everything else was lies? I stayed by her bedside during those final nights, holding her papery hand, and she'd drift in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling me by her sister's name, sometimes asking for Daniel like she'd forgotten he was a monster. On her last lucid day, Margaret grabbed my wrist with a strength that shocked me and pulled me close. Her breath smelled like medicine and decay, but her eyes were crystal clear, clearer than they'd been in weeks. "Karen, listen to me carefully, because I don't have much time left," she rasped, and I felt my throat close up, because this was it. These were going to be her last real words to me. She told me she'd always known Daniel was selfish, that she'd watched him manipulate people his whole life, but she'd hoped marriage would change him. "I was wrong," she whispered. And I'm sorry I brought that karma into your life." The way she said it made me realize she'd been carrying guilt for her son's sins, like mothers do. Then she said something that made absolutely no sense at first. "After the funeral, you need to go to my old house in Ashford, the one where Daniel grew up. Go alone. Don't tell anyone." I nodded, confused, wondering if the morphine was making her delusional. But she squeezed harder, her nails digging into my skin. "In the kitchen, there's a corner by the window where I kept my preserves. Under the floorboard beneath the old ceramic crock, there's something buried. You need to dig it up, Karen. Dig deep." Her voice had this urgency that cut through the fog of medication, and I felt goosebumps rise on my arms because this wasn't random dying confusion. This was a mission, a secret she'd held onto for this exact moment. I asked her what was buried there, but she just shook her head and smiled this sad, knowing smile. "Justice," she said. "I buried justice for the day you'd need it most, and baby, that day is coming." She made me promise I'd go, made me swear on everything I held sacred that I wouldn't let Daniel know, wouldn't let anyone stop me from following through. The truth was hidden there, she said. Something that would give me back my dignity and make him pay for every lie. I promised, even though I had no idea what I was promising to do, and she finally relaxed back into her pillows, that terrible tension leaving her body like she'd just passed a baton she'd been carrying for miles. Margaret died 2 nights later, at 3 a.m, with me holding her hand and rain pounding against the windows. I felt the exact moment she left because her grip loosened and her breathing just stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, like the whole world had paused to acknowledge that something important had ended. I sat there for an hour before I called the hospice nurse, just holding her cooling hand and crying for this woman who'd suffered because of her son's choices, who'd spent her final weeks watching me suffer too. She'd been betrayed by Daniel as much as I had, maybe more, because he'd abandoned his own dying mother for a vacation with his mistress and never looked back. The shamed feeling of that, of knowing he could do that to the woman who gave him life, made me understand just how little I'd ever meant to him. When I finally stood up and walked out of that room, I felt different, hollowed out but also somehow sharper, like grief had burned away all the softness that made me easy to use. I had a funeral to plan alone. A husband who'd probably show his face on a video call and fake tears for relatives, and a mysterious treasure hunt waiting for me in Ashford under a kitchen floor. Margaret's last words kept playing in my head. Dig deep. Justice. Make him pay. I didn't know yet what I was going to find under those floorboards, but I knew with absolute certainty that whatever it was going to change everything. Daniel had no idea what his mother had left behind. No idea that his payback was waiting in the dirt of his childhood home. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something close to hope. Planning Margaret's funeral alone was its own special kind of hell, made worse by the fact that Daniel decided he couldn't possibly come back for his own mother's burial. He called me the day after she died, and I expected at least some decency, some shred of the man I'd married showing up for this. Instead, he fed me this elaborate story about critical project deadline and non-refundable client commitments, and how he'd never forgive himself, but his hands were tied. The lies came smooth as butter, and I listened in silence, phone pressed to my ear, wondering how I'd ever believed anything this man said. He promised to attend via video call, to be there in spirit, and asked if I could handle the arrangement since I knew his mother's wishes better anyway. The audacity of it left me speechless. The funeral home, the flowers, the casket, the burial plot. I arranged every detail while fielding calls from relatives asking where Daniel was. I lied for him, smooth as he'd taught me, saying work emergency and overseas obligations, because what was I supposed to say? That your nephew abandoned his dying mother for a beach vacation with his mistress? That he couldn't be bothered to fly home because he was too busy living a double life? I smiled through the planning meetings, signed documents as acting family representative, and felt the humiliation of it burn through my exhaustion. At night, I'd go home to that empty house that still smelled like sickness and think about Margaret's words. Dig deep, find justice, make him pay. The funeral itself was a performance worthy of an Oscar, with Daniel's face blown up on a tablet propped on a chair in the front row. He zoomed in from what looked like a hotel room, wearing a black suit and practicing his grief face for the camera. Relatives who didn't know better came up to the screen to offer condolences, and he played it perfectly, voice cracking at just the right moments, talking about his amazing mother and how destroyed he was that he couldn't be there in person. I watched him wipe away tears that I knew were fake, accepting sympathy from people who had no idea they were comforting a liar. The betrayal of watching him perform grief while I'd actually lived it, actually held his mother's hand as she died, made me want to smash that tablet into 1,000,000 pieces. People kept telling me how strong I was, how devoted. What a blessing it was that Margaret had me in her final days. They'd hug me and whisper that Daniel was lucky to have such a selfless wife, that he must be so grateful for everything I'd done. I smiled and thanked them, played the gracious daughter-in-law. But inside, I was screaming. These people had no idea that their praise was just another layer of the lie, that I wasn't strong. I was trapped. After the service, as I watched Margaret's casket get lowered into the ground, I felt this strange calm wash over me. She was free now. Free from pain, and free from the disappointment of having raised a son like Daniel. And soon, if her final instructions meant what I thought they meant, I'd be free too. That night, after the last casserole-bearing neighbor left and the house fell silent, I sat at the kitchen table with Margaret's old address in Ashford written on a piece of paper. Daniel called to check in, his grief face replaced with relief now that the performance was over. He mentioned he'd probably be extending his time in London, since the project was gaining momentum. And would I be okay managing things at home for just a bit longer? I told him I'd be fine, that I was planning to take a few days to myself to grieve, maybe visit some old friends. He sounded thrilled that I wasn't falling apart, wasn't demanding he come home, wasn't being difficult. The revenge fantasy that had been building in my head crystallized into a plan. Let him think I was broken and compliant while I went to dig up whatever weapon Margaret had left me. I booked a rental car for the next morning and told no one where I was going. Margaret's house in Ashford was 2 hours away. Ashford was the kind of small town where secrets don't die. They get buried. The house had been shut up for years, not abandoned, just left to rot quietly. She hadn't lived there in decades, but she never sold it. She kept it like a shrine and a vault. But somewhere under those floorboards was the truth she'd protected, the justice she'd promised, and I was going to find it even if I had to tear that whole kitchen apart. Daniel sent me a goodnight text with a heart emoji, probably lying next to Natalie in their Miami hotel room, completely clueless that his dead mother had set a trap from beyond the grave. I looked at that heart emoji and felt nothing but cold determination. Tomorrow, I'd drive to Ashford. Tomorrow, I'd dig. And tomorrow, the karma Daniel had been dodging his entire life was going to start catching up to him in ways he couldn't imagine. The drive to Ashford felt like traveling to another dimension, leaving behind the suffocating reality of my life for something unknown and possibly dangerous. Margaret's old house sat at the end of a gravel road, a tired Victorian with peeling paint and overgrown gardens that looked like nobody had loved it in years. I used the key she'd kept in her belongings, and the door creaked open to reveal decades of dust floating in the afternoon light. The air inside smelled like old wood and memories, and I stood in the entryway for a moment, feeling like I was trespassing on sacred ground, even though Margaret had sent me here specifically. The kitchen was exactly where she'd described, to the left, through a narrow hallway, with a window overlooking what used to be a garden. I found the corner she'd mentioned, where an old ceramic crock sat exactly as she'd described, probably untouched for years. My hands were shaking as I moved it aside, and sure enough, the floorboard beneath it looked different from the others, slightly raised, like it had been pried up and replaced many times. I didn't have proper tools, so I used a screwdriver from my car's emergency kit, wedging it into the gap and pulling until the wood groaned and lifted. Underneath was just dirt and darkness, and for a horrible moment, I thought maybe Margaret's mind had been playing tricks, that the morphine had created a fantasy that I'd driven 2 hours to chase. But then my fingers hit something solid, something metal, and my heart started racing. I dug with my bare hands, dirt caking under my fingernails, until I pulled out a rusted metal tin about the size of a shoebox. It was heavy, sealed with what looked like layers of old tape and wax. protected like someone had wanted to preserve it through a nuclear war. I sat back on that dusty kitchen floor, holding this mystery box that my mother-in-law had hidden from her own son, and felt tears start to fall before I even opened it. Whatever was inside had been important enough for Margaret to keep secret her entire life. Important enough to only reveal with her literal dying breath. The weight of that trust pressed down on me as I carefully peeled away the seal, my fingers trembling so hard I could barely grip the edges. Inside was a bank passbook wrapped in plastic. And when I opened it, I couldn't believe the numbers I was seeing. $150,000. The account was in Margaret's maiden name, Henderson, not Carter, opened in 1987 and apparently untouched since 2003. Deposit slips showed decades of careful saving, small amounts adding up over years, all kept completely separate from any family knowledge. I flipped through the pages with growing shock, realizing Margaret had built this nest egg in absolute secrecy, probably knowing even back then that her son couldn't be trusted with money or responsibility. She hadn't touched the account in years on purpose, because untouched means untraceable. This wasn't just savings. This was an escape fund, a fuck you fund, insurance against the exact kind of betrayal I was living through. And she'd left it all to me. But the passbook wasn't the only thing in that tin. Underneath it was a manila envelope, brittle with age, sealed with more tape. I opened it with shaking hands and pulled out official documents. Birth certificates, legal papers, things that looked important and old. The first document I unfolded made my stomach drop. A certificate of adoption from 1979, stating that Margaret Ann Henderson had adopted a male infant, originally named Baby Doe, and renamed him Daniel Marcus Carter. Daniel was adopted. My husband, who'd spent his whole life acting entitled and superior, wasn't even Margaret's biological son. The shocking revelation hit me like a physical blow. She'd never told him, had taken this secret to her grave, and now I understood why. Margaret did a closed adoption. No one spoke of it. Not her sisters, not the neighbors, because she made sure there was nothing to talk about. Daniel never suspected because Margaret overcompensated. Photos, stories, traditions, a whole manufactured legacy. And he never questioned it, because entitlement doesn't ask questions. There was a letter, too, in Margaret's handwriting, dated just 6 months ago when she must have known she was dying. Dear Karen, it began, and I had to stop reading twice because I was crying too hard to see. She explained everything. How she'd adopted Daniel after years of infertility. How she'd loved him fiercely, but watched him grow into someone selfish and cruel. How she'd started hiding money when he was a teenager because she saw the greed in him. This money is yours now, she wrote. Not as inheritance, but as protection. He'll come back when he thinks there's something to gain. And when he does, you'll have the power to destroy him. The adoption papers are your nuclear option. Use them wisely. The letter ended with, You deserved better than my son. But since you got stuck with him, at least take everything he thought was his. Justice isn't always pretty, but it's always necessary. Love, Margaret. I sat on that kitchen floor, surrounded by dust and secrets, holding $150,000 and the weapon that would dismantle Daniel's entire identity, and I finally understood what Margaret meant by vengeance. She'd given me the keys to his destruction, wrapped up in legal documents and decades of hidden money, and all I had to do was wait for him to walk into the trap. I drove back from Ashford in a daze, the metal tin sitting in my passenger seat like a loaded gun. Every few miles I'd glance over at it, still not quite believing what I'd found, what Margaret had entrusted me with, $150,000 and the secret that Daniel wasn't who he thought he was. It was more power than I'd held in my entire marriage, maybe my entire life. The truth about his adoption rewrote everything I knew about him. All those times he'd talked about family legacy and Carter traditions. All the times he'd acted like he was born into some kind of dynasty instead of chosen from an orphanage by a woman who'd tried desperately to love him into being decent. Margaret had known her son was rotten, and she'd spent decades preparing an escape route for whoever would eventually need it. When I got home, I hid the tin in the back of my closet, behind boxes of old winter clothes Daniel never bothered to look through. Then I did something calculated and cold that the old Karen never would have done. I waited. I didn't call him, didn't confront him about Miami or Natalie or any of the lies. I just went about my life like a widow in mourning, posting appropriate things on social media about grief and loss, accepting condolences from people who had no idea I was actually planning a war. Daniel called a few days later, his voice dripping with fake concern, asking how I was holding up after his mother's death. I played broken and fragile, told him I missed Margaret terribly, that the house felt so empty without her. He ate it up, probably relieved I wasn't demanding he come home or asking hard questions about his extended work trip. Then, exactly 2 weeks after the funeral, Daniel dropped the bomb I'd been waiting for. So, I've been thinking, my mother probably had some savings, maybe a small life insurance policy. We should look into her estate, see what needs to be settled. There it was. The greed. The real reason he'd eventually come back. He wasn't mourning his mother. He was circling her corpse like a vulture, looking for whatever scraps of money she might have left behind. I let the silence stretch just long enough to sound hesitant, then said quietly, "Actually, I haven't found much. Maybe some old bank statements. I haven't really had the strength to go through everything." I could practically hear him deflate through the phone, disappointed that his mother hadn't left a fortune for him to claim. But I planted the seed carefully, like Margaret had taught me through her actions. Although, she did mention once that she had accounts I didn't know about. "Family stuff from before you were born," she said. I made my voice uncertain, confused, like I didn't quite understand what it meant. Daniel's tone shifted immediately, got sharper, more interested. "Really? What kind of accounts? Did she give you any paperwork?" The karma of watching him take the bait was delicious. He had no idea he was swimming straight toward the hook. I told him I'd look through her old documents, that maybe there was something at the Ashford house I'd missed. "You should probably come back and help me sort through it all," I added, making it sound like I needed him, like I was still the helpless wife who couldn't handle things alone. The next day, Daniel announced he was wrapping up the London project early and would be home within the week. Just like that, after months of excuses about why he couldn't leave, suddenly he could drop everything and fly back. Not for his mother's funeral, not to support his grieving wife, but because there might be money involved. The infidelity, the betrayal, the cheating. All of it paled next to this moment of pure, undisguised greed. I confirmed his flight details, told him how relieved I was that he'd finally be home, and hung up feeling like a chess player who'd just moved their queen into position. He thought he was coming back to claim an inheritance, to collect whatever his mother had left behind and probably file for divorce so he could run off with Natalie permanently. What Daniel didn't know was that I'd already opened the bank account Margaret left me. The passbook came with the power Margaret had prepared, signed instructions and a beneficiary designation, transferred the money to a new account in only my name, and made copies of every document in that tin. The adoption certificate was safely stored in a lawyer's office downtown, a lawyer I'd consulted just to understand my options, along with all the screenshots from his Google Photos and a detailed timeline of his lies. Margaret's letter sat on my bedside table, and I'd read it every night like a prayer. Justice isn't always pretty, but it's always necessary. I didn't see it as ammo at first. I saw it as tragedy, but tragedy is exactly what Daniel weaponized, so I learned to weaponize back. I wasn't going to punish him for being adopted. I was going to punish him for thinking he owned everyone. Daniel was flying home thinking he'd won, thinking he'd managed his double life perfectly, and now got to cash in on his mother's death. Instead, he was walking straight into the trap a dying woman had spent her last breath setting. And I was going to enjoy every second of watching it snap shut around him, reclaiming the dignity and self-worth he'd stolen while he was too busy backstabbing me to notice I'd become someone who could destroy him completely. So here's my question for you. Have you ever had that moment where you realized someone you trusted was playing you the whole time? That sickening feeling when the lies unravel and you see their true face staring back at you? Drop a comment below and tell me your story, because I know I'm not the only one who's been backstabbed by someone who was supposed to love them. Did you get your revenge? Or are you still waiting for your karma moment? And here's the real question that keeps me up at night. If someone handed you the weapon to destroy the person who destroyed you, would you use it or would you walk away? I chose justice. But what would you choose? Maybe you're watching this and thinking about your own situation. That husband who's working late too often. That family member who only shows up when there's money involved. That friend who disappeared when you needed them most. Here's what I learned the hard way. Trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If someone's story has too many convenient excuses, they're lying. And if you're doing all the suffering while they're doing all the living, you're not in a partnership. You're in a scam. Tell me in the comments, what's the biggest red flag you ignored because you wanted to believe the best in someone? What would you tell your past self if you could go back to that moment before everything fell apart? And let's talk about family secrets for a second, because Margaret's decision to hide that adoption certificate for decades changed everything. Do you think she was right to keep that from Daniel his whole life? Was it protection, or was it cruel? Would knowing he was adopted have made him a better person? Or would he have used it as just another excuse for his behavior? I'm genuinely curious what you think, because this moral gray area still messes with my head. Comment below with your take. Are there some secrets that should stay buried? Or does everyone deserve to know the truth about where they came from, even if that truth is ugly? Here's something else I want to know. Have you ever been the person left holding everything together while someone else got to live their best life? The one doing the hospital visits, the bill paying, the exhausting, invisible labor while someone else took the credit or worse, just disappeared? Because that shamed and humiliated feeling of being taken for granted, of being used up and thrown away, it changes you. It either breaks you or it builds you into someone unbreakable. Which one happened to you? And if you're in that situation right now, what's stopping you from walking away or fighting back? Let's talk about it in the comments. No judgment, just honest conversation about what it takes to reclaim your dignity. Before you go, I need you to do something for me. If this story resonated with you, if it made you feel seen or validated or just plain angry on my behalf, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I'm not done telling stories about betrayal, revenge, and the sweet taste of karma catching up to people who thought they were untouchable. There are more chapters to this saga, more shocking revelations about what happened when Daniel finally came home and walked into the trap Margaret and I set for him. You're going to want to see how this ends. Trust me, the payback is even better than you're imagining. Plus, I share insights and strategies for anyone dealing with family drama, infidelity, or toxic relationships, and I promise you'll never get surface-level advice here. We dig deep, just like Margaret told me to. So, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and drop a comment telling me, Team Karen, or do you think I went too far? What would you have done with that adoption certificate and that money? And most importantly, do you believe in revenge, or do you think karma handles itself without our help? I'll be reading every single comment because your stories, your pain, your victories, they matter just as much as mine. Let's build a community of people who refuse to be doormats, who choose self-worth over silence, and who know that sometimes justice needs a little push in the right direction. See you in the comments, and see you in the next video where I tell you exactly what happened when Daniel walked through that door expecting an inheritance and got a reckoning instead.